Welcome everyone in this roundtable and book lounge. The Spatial Reformation, Euclid Between Man, Cosmos and God is the title of Professor Michael Sauter's work. And it's our pleasure to have you here today, Mike, in this beautiful morning. I'm also pleased to have my fellow Gildo Magalhães. And nothing further, I give you Professor Michael Sauter.
Good morning. Yes, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Dr. Ana Paula Tavares and Dr. Gildo Magalhães for the invitation to speak here today at the Institute for Advanced Study. We're passing around just a glossary of names. The talk that I will be delivering covers roughly 5 centuries of European intellectual history, and it's difficult to I think it's difficult to expect that everyone knows every single name that I will mention. So at some point when a name comes up, it is on the list for you, including the dates to kind of help orient people within the course of this talk. So today I'd like to discuss some points that I make in my most recent book, The Spatial Reformation, which appeared in November with the University of Pennsylvania Press. In this book, I make one very broad argument and I derive 2 fundamental implications from it. First, the argument. I hold that all of European thought and culture between 1350 and 1850 is shaped and determined by the rise and decline of Euclidean space, as we were just mentioning earlier this morning. I should add parenthetically that I identify these 5 centuries as the early modern period. There is a whole debate about what early modern versus modern. My point is that early modern is 1350 to 1850. Other historians will disagree with me, but that's the stuff of history. Now the implications. On the one hand, and this is more for the intellectual historian types in the audience, my emphasis on space allows us to organize Western thought's entire expanse in accord with its spatial regime. So in the book, I suggest that we think in terms of pre-Euclidean, Euclidean, and post-Euclidean phases of Western thought. And as we were mentioning earlier, once you get into the post-Euclidean world, it gets really weird. On the other hand, and this is the second implication, and this is now more general for everyone in the room, my reading of space's role within European intellectual history suggests that in any given period, the underlying spatial regime determines how all things are known, and that includes especially things that none of us can actually see. So more than that I can't offer about the book because the argument goes down many avenues, and Gildo will be, I'm sure, willing to testify to that. And it covers just about every aspect of early modern European thought and culture. Instead, I want to illustrate my point about ways of knowing by radically shifting everyone's perspective and ask that all of you consider this image. See if I hit the right button. I did it. Okay, this photograph was taken in 1972 by the Apollo 17 astronauts as they were heading to the moon. I assume that the thing needs no introduction. So let me pose a question. How many of you have actually seen this thing with your own eyes? That is to say, how many of you have been far out enough in space to enjoy this panorama? I didn't think so. Yeah. No Apollo astronauts in the audience. Nevertheless, even though none of us has ever been far out enough out there to take in this view, all of us know immediately what this giant body is. And this fact leads me to another question. Can anyone tell me what's odd about this picture? It's upside down. Here's our Earth presented correctly. Okay? And that is in accord with the demands of our collective imagination, because none of us have ever actually seen this thing, and yet we think it has an up. So I want to pause for a moment about the implications of this little experiment. We all share a knowledge base that tells us what this huge blob looks like, even though none of us has ever actually seen it. This is a rather odd epistemological situation, and it is worthy of much more discussion than I can offer here. For the purposes of this talk, though, I want to concentrate on 2 themes within the many and varied problems that my book discusses. First of all of us are certain that this thing has an up even though none of us has experienced it in a way that allows us to apply this up. And consider along these lines that up in daily life is just this, the earth below and the eyes looking upward. And that means that we deploy an up in our lives here on that earth that differs from the one we apply to the earth as a unitary body, which of course we've never seen. Second, and this is perhaps the strangest thing of all, when we think of the earth, we apply this extraterrestrial up to this whole, even though, as all of us learned in modern physics, there's no up in outer space. We simply float. So our image of the blue marble, and that is actually what NASA calls this picture, cannot be taken as a mere representation of a scientific fact, but must be seen as a cultural construct that exists within a shared sense of space. And this space has a history. So this is where the intellectual history begins to enter. I cannot present even this history in its entirety, and in reality, I don't think I could do it in the book either. It's such a big topic. So I'm going to pull out one theme that cuts across the whole analysis. Namely, how within European thought's confines, Euclidean notions of space undermined ancient views of the divine. I take this route because the physical position that this thing requires us to take or to associate ourselves with was for probably 2 millennia associated exclusively with the divine. As you know, European culture long remained deeply Christian, which meant that the Bible's outline in the book of Genesis of a hierarchical, geocentric cosmos in which God was perched above and the rest of us languished below remained the basic frame of reference. And here is perhaps the most well-known example of this worldview within the history of science literature, a cosmological drawing that was originally published by the cosmographer Peter Appian in Ingolstadt, Bavaria in 1529. And if you will note, up there in the top corner, you can see the Latin phrase, habitaculum Dei et omnium electorum. That is the abode of God and all the saints. So what you see here is a cosmos that includes man and God, and we are down here at the bottom in this little blob, okay, which is earth, air, fire, and water. And the rest of the cosmos is perfect space. You'll notice this first circle here, lunae, that is where perfect space begins and imperfect space is below. This is a distinction I will return to. So against this particular backdrop, you can understand how a homogeneous space that denied qualitative differences between above and below, that is, a wholly Euclidean space of the sort you learned in high school, challenged this physical structure implicitly. And that challenge yielded what I call in the book the Spatial Reformation. So my notion of a spatial reformation is rooted in something about European thought's development and culture that has long been overlooked among intellectual historians. After 1350, European thought came to have 2 sacred texts, namely the Bible, which is the obvious one, and Euclid's Elements. Both works had, of course, been accessible to the medieval culture that preceded the early modern one, and both rapidly entered print in the 15th century in the wake of Johannes Gutenberg's perfection of movable type. Indeed, and this is something that I have discovered is completely forgotten among my colleagues in intellectual history, the Elements is second only to the Bible in terms of the total number of print editions. So if you list them now, to this day, the most often published book is the Bible, and number 2 is Euclid's Elements, although in the Elements, it's often in high school textbooks. So Euclid is gone, but it's still his geometry that is published. And this is another thing, Gildo, that in the history of science makes Euclid's Elements unique. It is, near as I can tell, the only ancient book that is still in use in modern education, setting aside language study, classes where you would obviously read classical texts. Most important, however, after we get all this publication stuff out of the way, is that the Elements was read in completely new ways after 1350. And this shift had profound implications for European thought up to 1850. Now, in order to understand this point, we have to underscore that the Bible and the Elements were in profound tension on the question of space. Consider the biblical view of the cosmos, which you see partly depicted here, incorporated a hierarchical arrangement of heaven and earth, that is, above and below. You always know where you are in this system. While the elements denied such a hierarchy through its cultivation of uniform space. And as you know, within the Euclidean matrix, points are nothing. And there is no one point inside of Euclid that is more important than another point. So after 1350, when Euclid's thought was ever more applied to the Bible's cosmos, a transformation in the divine became unavoidable, because the divine, as you see up here in the Habitaculum Dei, sits above. And once there's no above and below, where do you put God? This becomes a fundamental problem of European thought. The emphasis on spatial hierarchy that you see depicted here in this 16th century image has a long history within European thought, and I can't really reconstruct it here, except to note that this hierarchy became fundamental when Aristotle, it's always Aristotle, but when Aristotle came back in the 12th century AD. This is a complicated story, and I will only emphasize one much overlooked aspect of it, namely that Aristotle's works returned in Latin translation at roughly the same time as Euclid's Elements did. They're both 12th century phenomena. And the result is that when European philosophers began to read both these texts, they accepted the Aristotelian notion of space and they rejected the Euclidean notion of space. Contrary to what people may expect, in the medieval period, Euclid is not about space, he's about measurement. Every single thing can be measured according to the Bible. As you know, God can count the number of hairs on your head, less so in my case than there was in the past. But medieval people reading Euclid used him exclusively to measure stuff, because stuff is what God produced. They didn't use him to project space, because that would have put them up in the perfect realms where God lives. So Aristotle, for his part, denied homogeneity of any sort and cultivated what I discuss in the book as fractured space. So on the one hand, he held that space was not diffused in a geometric sense. I know this is going to sound very weird for all of us who've studied our Euclid, but he argued that space is defined by its container. So space exists inside this cup. It is not an independent, empty thing that governs the relation of things. It is actually contained in something. And then, as this image indicates, he transferred this idea to the cosmos. And he argued that concentric crystalline spheres surrounded the Earth, which I would just underscore here, is not a planet. In the Middle Ages, the Earth is not a planet, it's a blob of substances that have gathered at the center of the cosmos. And this imperfect world of stuff is then surrounded by the perfect world of containers. And there is no one space that governs this cosmos, instead there are only spaces. So you can see Euclid has no place in in this cosmology. Just on the moment he begins to spread, we begin to see tension intellectually within European thought. So the medieval appropriation of Aristotle yielded this rigid Christian cosmovision, which you see here, and it's riven by a fundamental spatial dichotomy. If you look where the flames are, that's the end of where we live. Everything above that, the lunar circle, is the heavens. And what are the heavens? They're simply pure regularity. Because people looking up to the heavens always knew where the moon was going to be. They always knew that the sun was going to come up at a certain hour the next morning. They knew where the stars moved across the heavens. So within this Christian Aristotelian world, there is a fundamental difference between terrestrial and extraterrestrial. One is perfect and the other isn't. We'll see that in a second in another image. So in this context, it was critical that Aristotle also argued that the heavens were qualitatively different from the terrestrial realm, because this paralleled, conveniently, Christianity's view that God was up in his abode. Okay, so beginning in the 13th century, you have these two worldviews, the Christian and the ancient Greek, melding together to create this very rigid cosmos. Moreover, since medieval Christians believed their God to be omnipresent, they readily absorbed another Aristotelian doctrine. The cosmos was organized by reason. And this is extremely important within Western thought. Even to this day, you can read books by Christian thinkers who argue that nature should be understood as pure reason. So that God diffuses himself through this cosmos, creating the structure. It is thoroughly rational. He can be omnipresent through reason, and you can find your way back up to him through reason. Right? This gets blown up in the 14th century by other thinkers, but it's important to keep in mind that the cosmos is not a spatial construct, it is a rational construct. And as long as that reason is defined along fractured spatial lines, Euclid is outside the Western worldview. You will now see one of my favorite images, a 13th century example of exactly this approach to space. Okay? This is from something called the Bible moralisée. They begin appearing in the 12th century. They're essentially a children's book Bible, is how we would look at it today. It's biblical tales, various stories about the saints, all put together in a giant book, and then lots of pretty pictures. Okay. In this picture, you have Jesus of Nazareth. It's never quite clear in medieval and 13th century thought whether we're talking Jesus or God or the Holy Ghost. They kind of mix it all together in one. But look what he has in his hands. It's a compass. This is God the geometer. Okay? And notice what he's measuring. This undifferentiated blob that is the earth. So God is the one entity that is capable of measuring the earth, okay? But that measurement requires you to have a perspective from above down. You don't measure the earth if you're standing on it looking up. So already you can see that in the whole way that their thought is constructed in the medieval period, geometry of the Euclidean form is not a human thing. It is an extraterrestrial thing. So I'll now pursue in more detail how Euclid's space is received after 1350 and how this alters the long-standing hierarchical relationship that we see presented here in this 13th century image. By the way, if you're interested in this image, it's in Vienna. There are not many copies of these Bibles moralisées around. One of them happens to be in Vienna, one is in Paris. And they're all on the internet if you want to see them. This is just the one I could get the rights to. They didn't want to charge me, so I took it. There are others, however, that are prettier, but they're expensive. So here I turn now to a great Renaissance thinker, a man named Nicholas of Cusa. Some of you may have run across him before. In 1443, while pondering humanity's relationship to the divine as we see it expressed here, Cusa wrote the following, I quote, "Thus man is God, but not absolutely because he is man. Humanly, therefore, he is God. Furthermore, man is a world, but not comprising all, because he is man." End quote. This meditation on man points to the fundamental trend in early modern thought and culture from 1350 to 1850. God's slow departure from the intellectual center, where you can see him here with his compass, and his constant marginalization to the point that humanity occupies that very spot. In essence, we want to get to the point where humanity is the one holding the compass. Cusa didn't initiate this pending swap, but he sensed its onset, and he intuited its most significant implication, namely, to celebrate humanity's ability to think its world altered the relationship between the human and the divine. Another example. In 1482, the Italian humanist Francesco Berlingueri wrote that the then recently reinvented terrestrial maps, that's another story, unfortunately, I can't get into here, but that these maps, quote, "offered divine intellect to human genius, as if it were by nature celestial, demonstrating how, with true discipline, we can leap up within ourselves without the aid of wings, so that we may view earth through an image marked on a parchment. Its truth and greatness declared, we may circle all or a part of it, pilgrims through the color of a flat parchment, around which the heavens and the stars revolve." End quote. In 1536, the German reformer Philipp Melanchthon said something similar, although he was referring to geometry. He wrote, quote, "There is here great praise of geometry, which did not cling to inadequate and inferior human constructions, but flew into heaven and transported human minds, which were stuck in the mud, back up to the heavenly throne." End quote. Writing in 1603, William Shakespeare hit the same theme in Hamlet's exclamation, quote, "What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form, in moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god," end quote. Now, Shakespeare's readers know that the Prince of Denmark himself was not entirely taken with humanity. Nevertheless, Cusa, Berlinghieri, Melanchthon, and Shakespeare himself were certainly impressed, as is evidenced by how each associated the human imagination with the divine. What united all of these thinkers and their reflections on humanity was the era's increasing emphasis on the study of geometry. Medieval thinkers had also studied Euclid's work, but they concentrated on the planar geometry in Euclid's first 6 books, which meant they only dealt with circles and triangles. And here I'll have to step outside the presentation for a second. Euclid has 13 books. The first 6 are planar geometry. So triangles, circles, squares, that sort of thing. Then you get into 3 books, 7 through 10, which discuss the unity of number. So the continuity of number, number understood as a line, and then in the last 3 books, you get spherical geometry. And that aspect of Euclid was not read in the Middle Ages because they had Aristotle. So they only thought of Euclid in terms of his 2-dimensional geometry. They never even read this stuff on number because they couldn't understand it. So early modern thinkers, however, read those last 3 books. And so they began to think about spheres. And armed now with this full sense of space, Europeans began to apply this whole to the fractured Christian world. And one thing I want to concentrate on here is if you look at the earth, you see that it is essentially chaos. And people who are convinced that the earth is chaos don't make maps because it's not worth representing. It's discontinuous. So if the earth is constantly changing, how can you have a geography? Certainly not in 3-dimensional space. And this gap in European thought is overcome in the 15th century as Europeans begin to apply mathematics to the terrestrial realm. They take their Euclid and they give the earth 360 degrees, and once you have these degrees, now you can begin depicting the continents. This actually happens before anybody sails to the New World, which is quite an important intellectual shift. So as a result, Europeans began to see all things, just as Berlinghieri and Melanchthon suggested, from this once divine perspective. And the effects were profound. In 1611, the poet John Donne wrote, quote, "On a round ball, a workman that has copies by can lay an Europe, Afrique, and an Asia, and quickly make that, which was nothing, all," end quote. Now, as you know, the Bible had long taught Europeans that God created the cosmos ex nihilo. Nevertheless, a 3-dimensional mode of spatial representation, which is what a globe is, now sustained a perspective on creation that, as Shakespeare had suggested, made humanity a little god. And just to add some heft to my discussion of Donne's views on globes, here is a 17th century drawing of the Bodleian Library. It was opened in 1602. It's at the University of Oxford. And we know that John Donne used this library from time to time. He was not allowed to appear at court in London because the king didn't want him there. He wanted him safely in Oxford where he couldn't hit on any of the king's mistresses. Donne himself was a pretty busy guy as well. So he was stuck in the Bodleian Library, and it is very likely that that poem I just read you about globes is based on one of these globes here, because those were very rare at the time. So he probably looked at one of, it's not clear from the image which is the earth and which is heaven, but one of them would have been the earth. So Donne, when he wrote his poem, was probably thinking of one of these globes in this library. So Donne's discussion of globes calls attention to a theme that has yet to be integrated into the intellectual historical literature, namely how truly productive the relationship was between Euclidean projected space and the emergence of a material culture of space. And this culture we all grew up in. I had a globe in every library I ever sat in grammar school. We have all been taught to see the earth, just like Donne saw the earth, on this little round ball. Early modern Europeans repeatedly transmuted imagined space into print and material representations of things unseen. For example, Although Nicholas of Cusa never saw a terrestrial globe because they hadn't been invented yet, we know that he owned a celestial one, with which he subjected heaven itself to his own eyes. And Cusa's globe actually still exists. It's a little 15th century blob with a handle on the bottom, and you can visit it in Germany. It's in Kues, a little town on the Moselle. Cusa obviously never contemplated the celestial realm from above any more than Donne had gazed onto the whole earth, yet both accepted that humanity could treat as knowledge an imagined and geometrically infused perspective on creation. This is what separates what Donne is looking at in his library from the image from the Bible Moralisée that we just saw previously, is that the earth is now a regularized space, and it's been regularized by our ability to imagine a space that is whole. In this context, I'll call your attention to this image, which presents the reverse side of a memorial medallion that Renaissance artist Matteo de Pasti struck somewhere between 1446 and 1450 in honor of the great polymath Leon Battista Alberti. Alberti's profile is actually on the other side, but it's not important to us right now. Alberti himself knew Euclid's geometry very well. In fact, he took lessons in geometry from another Italian named Paolo Toscanelli. He published extensively on art, architecture, and mathematics, almost always citing Euclid. It is therefore significant that the medal presents Alberti's personal sign, the winged eye in the middle. This is actually what he took to be his motto. And along with that, underneath, you'll see the eye, the two Latin words, quid tum. This was his rather personal motto. I guess today you would have it, you would put it on you as a tattoo. These two features direct our attention to the profoundest among space's effects. First, Alberti's winged eye expressly resituates humanity in relation to the medieval physical cosmos because it liberates the human gaze from the terrestrial realm. The eye is now floating through an open space. So whereas human beings had once always looked up to the heavens, they could now go out and look back. And second, this is the really funny part, the Latin motto evokes a renewal of humanity's relationship to the divine insofar as quid tum translates roughly as what now? In proper English, what then is how we would say it. So what we have here is a representation in a medallion of humanity's liberation from the terrestrial realm, and all of this is happening because they've been reading Euclid's Elements. They are now free to move their mind about space. So in this respect, I ask you to contemplate another image. This is a rather famous one in the history of science, as Gildo can surely tell you. It comes from Johannes Kepler's Mysterium Cosmographicum, a justly famous cosmological work that the then very young astronomer published in Tübingen in 1596. Kepler was trying to explain the distance between the planets' ostensibly circular orbits. This was a long-standing problem within cosmology, how to explain why the planets are at different distances from each other. So he inserted in between each planet's orbit a different, what are known as Platonic geometric forms. And he later concluded that he's wrong. Okay? And the reason that he was wrong is that the planets don't actually move in circular orbits, they move in elliptical orbits. So all of this Platonic stuff comes tumbling down. But amidst all the celebrating of Kepler's discovery that the planets are elliptical, we've lost something. This image, like all future cosmological images, are bathing the cosmos and the viewer in uniform geometric space, because we are now looking at something that could be built, like the globes in the library, could be put in front of us, produced by someone who's imagined space, and we have to imagine ourselves as being above the cosmos. So we are now in habitaculum Dei. So this had two effects. First, thanks to the production of a material culture of the cosmos, humanity could look down on the solar system from the once divine perspective. And this is the second point. This is very important for early modern culture in the 17th century. There's no place for God. Notice he's not here. He doesn't have a compass. He doesn't have a little house up there. He is simply removed from the image because he cannot be here anymore. We can feel the cultural power of God's sudden absence from the cosmos by looking to the work of Blaise Pascal. He was nothing if not a mathematician of pure genius. In fact, he was such a mathematical genius, he stopped doing math because he felt it affected his faith. he realized that he was chasing God from the cosmos with his pursuit of mathematical regularity. In 1654, for example, he wrote in his spiritual notebook, the Pensées, quote, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces fills me with dread. How many realms are unaware of us?" End quote. And Pascal's astral angst takes on an added significance when juxtaposed with this introductory fragment from his greatest book, quote, "The year of grace, 1654, Monday, 23 November, feast of St. Clement, Pope and Martyr, and others of Roman martyrology, eve of St. Chrysogonos, martyr, and others, from about 10:30 in the evening until about midnight," end quote. I'm thinking about starting my next book off like that too, yes. Unlike John Donne, for instance, Pascal is a heliocentrist. So how is he going to construct his relationship to God? He can only construct it historically, which is to say, I was here at this point in your calendar. You can see how the divine and space have been utterly separated because it doesn't matter where you are on the globe. The only thing that matters is when something happened, and that is a Christian timeline. So, but another way, since the earth is now in motion, the Frenchman has no choice but to use the Christian calendar to locate his religion. And one result was this pervasive fear of being alone in this hugely empty cosmos. And there's a chapter in my book on this, but one of the issues that absolutely roils 18th century thought is whether there are aliens and whether they have geometry. This is one of the big questions. And some scientists say, well, of course they have geometry. They have stars up above. And other scientists say, yeah, but they don't speak English or German or Latin or anything else, so how could they have Euclid? Anyway, it's a huge fight that runs well into the 19th century. So by the middle of the 17th century, what we see in Pascal is that thanks to Euclidean space's rise, man is now a little god, but he trembles. Space's relentless diffusion changes everything in European thought and culture. Consider, here's an overview for you. In the roughly 2 centuries that followed Cusa's death in 1464, Europe produced the following. In 1543, the heliocentrism of Nicolaus Copernicus. In 1637, the philosophical subjectivity of René Descartes. In 1651, the dour secular politics of Thomas Hobbes. And in 1687, the physics of Isaac Newton. Now, I can't retell any of these stories, although I touch on some of them in the book. Rather, what I want to emphasize is what they reveal collectively about space's effect on the divine. And here I offer perhaps the best example I have, a quote from Isaac Newton. Now, most of you know that the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy is the modern physics textbook. It's essentially the Euclid of modern physics. However, in a later edition, I think it's the 1710 edition, the original edition is 1687, Newton was getting savaged because he didn't put God in to his book. It's kind of an odd thing for a physicist to be thinking about. And he writes this reply in what's called the Scholium Generale, which appears at the end of the 1710 edition. Quote, "God is eternal and infinite, omnipotent and omniscient. That is, his duration reaches from eternity to eternity. His presence from infinity to infinity. He governs all things and knows all things that are or can be done. He is not eternity and infinity, but eternal and infinite. He is not duration and space, but he endures and is present. He endures forever and is everywhere present, and by existing always and everywhere, he constitutes duration and space. Since every particle of space is always, and every indivisible moment of duration is everywhere, certainly the maker and lord of all things cannot be never and nowhere." I don't find that to be a ringing endorsement of God's presence, that he cannot be never and nowhere. But this is the problem that space has given the Christian mind. Newton's words constitute nothing less than a spatialized anthropology, or better, a spatial justification for a godlike man. Because even as Newton celebrated his God, he had to put him someplace where he actually couldn't be. And man's rise does not stop there. As spatial projections expanded, the human mind enjoyed still greater freedom to range amid unseen realms. And here I turn to an example from A Short Introduction to the Noble Science of Astronomy, a textbook that was published in 1708 in Nuremberg by an astronomer and mathematician named Johann Gabriel Doppelmayr. And if you want to learn how to spell that name, he's on the list. This work provided a celestial tour that let go of the Earth as a reference point and began instead with the sun. Doppelmayr wrote, and I quote, "But we begin in the middle of our system and suppose ourselves to stand in the sun's center, looking outward with our own eyes and without any hindrance, whether from the sun's body or its powerful light, so that in every direction we can see before us, just as we do from the earth, all the stars in their proper order and size, because although our earth moves around the sun in a great circle over the course of a year, we will not sense the slightest change on account of the immeasurable distances involved," end quote. So boldly going where no mind had gone before, Doppelmayr projected a human perspective onto an unseen realm and fixed the hole inside a human space, one that had an up. And if you think about this, the book is published in 1708, and there's markedly little difference in its physics. You could read this thing today and actually still derive something from it. So a mind that puts itself above the earth and look down could just as well travel to the sun and look back. This is the central point of the Spatial Reformation. So in the book, I call this process of hounding God from the cosmos spatial secularization. In order to underscore how broad and profound the resulting changes were, I offer as another example a deservedly obscure poem by Friedrich Schiller entitled A Saying of Confucius. You're going to love this. Published in 1799, it associated Confucius falsely with geometry's conceptual rigor. There's a whole history behind that. And in the center are, as always, the Jesuits screwing everything up. But that's another story. Schiller wrote, "Threefold is space's measure. On and on, unremittingly, disquietingly strives length. Into the limitless expanse breadth pours itself. Fathomless depth sinks itself. For you, a picture these three endow. You must strive forward restlessly. Never stand still, we read, if you wish to see perfection. You must unfurl yourself into breadth if the world is to fashion itself for you. Into the depths must you descend if nature is to reveal herself to you. Only persistence achieves the goal. Only fullness leads to clarity, and in the abyss lives truth." These final lines return our attention to geometric space's inherently anti-Christian implications. In the book of Genesis, creation is described thus, quote, "In the beginning God created heaven and earth, but the earth was empty and unoccupied, and the darknesses were over the face of the abyss. And so the Spirit of God was brought over the waters." Within the Judeo-Christian tradition, it was God who confronted an abyss and responded by creating stuff. Something. Now, following Schiller, it was man who peered into darkness and dared to seek his own truth. Schiller underscores that spatial homogeneity reduced everything, including God, to three-dimensional space. And the Swabian poet-philosopher was hardly alone in wallowing in this space, as from 1350 to 1850, no major European thinker was uninitiated in the geometric discipline as it was defined by Euclid's Elements. And here I'll just offer you a partial list of the people that I am certain read Euclid's Elements. Nicole Oram, Nicholas of Cusa, Leonardo da Vinci, Peter Ramus, Albrecht Dürer, René Descartes, Blaise Pascal, Gottfried Leibniz, Thomas Hobbes, Isaac Newton, John Locke, Denis Diderot, Voltaire, Jeremy Bentham, Immanuel Kant, and Georg Hegel. That's not a bad club to be in. Every single one of these thinkers played a fundamental role in European thought's development, and every one of them studied Euclid in detail. In fact, Hegel wrote a whole book about Euclid that to this day is still not published. All of these thinkers confronted, however, the same problem. Euclidean notions of space were incompatible with Christianity's approach to the divine. Here I cite Pascal once again. In another part of the Pensée, he wrote, quote, "Let us then understand our condition. We are something, and we are not everything. Such being as we have removes us from knowledge of first principles, which arise out of nothingness." End quote. So what Pascal sensed throughout his pensée was that humanity's ability to project nothing, that is, space itself, was clouding its ability to understand properly its relationship to the divine. Put another way, the conceptual unity that came to envelop all early modern perspectives on the celestial and the terrestrial constituted an ever more explicit claim to God's mantle. So against this backdrop, it is important to underscore that although we are products of the European encounter with Euclidean space, we also stand beyond its most basic assumptions. And this is where the history in the intellectual history comes in. Our spatial sense is informed by innovations in mathematics that superseded Euclidean three-dimensionality. Early in the 19th century, some mathematicians argued that Euclid's assumptions were unjustified, including the famous parallel postulate. Rather than go into this history, I'll just summarize the main point. Mathematicians noted that Euclid's planar geometry, which appears in the first 6 books, did not hold when it came to the spherical space of the final 3 books. And just to give you an illustration, you all know that a triangle has 180 degrees, except if it's on a sphere. And if a triangle has more than 180 degrees, the parallel postulate does not hold. A lot of stuff explodes once you enter this post-Euclidean mathematics. The process of change took decades, and it reaches its apex with a German mathematician named Bernhard Riemann. In 1854, he delivered a talk at the University of Göttingen under the title, scintillating title, on the hypotheses that underlie geometry. This work, which was published in 1867, laid the foundation for a vision of space that included more than just 3 dimensions. In fact, by now, it includes infinite dimensions, thanks to a mathematician named von Neumann. This development's historical significance becomes especially apparent when we consider that Euclid had been incorporated precisely into the Newtonian revolution of the 17th century. For those of you who've read Newton, absolute space is Euclid. It's 1-to-1. And then the Kantian revolution of the 18th century. So the true founder of modern philosophy is a Euclidean. And we live in a post-Euclidean world, which means that Kant really doesn't have any relevance for us anymore. So once Euclid is dethroned, everything comes tumbling down, including God. I'll come back to the main point. So it's not surprising that at the end of the 19th century, new forms of intellectual desperation arose. And these have also largely been forgotten by intellectual historians. So given what I've said about Pascal, you can well imagine how he would have responded to modernist mathematics in which there is no logic in space at all. He was already on the verge of going crazy. Here I will conclude, however, with Fyodor Dostoevsky, perhaps in something of a surprise. In 1880, writing in the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky included this discussion between Ivan Karamazov and his brother Alyosha. Quote, "But you must note this. If God exists, and if he really did create the world, then, as we all know, he created it according to the geometry of Euclid and the human mind with the conception of only 3 dimensions in space. Yet, there have been and still are geometricians and philosophers, and even some of the most distinguished, who doubt whether the whole universe, or to speak more widely, the whole of being, was only created in Euclid's geometry. They even dare to dream that 2 parallel lines, which according to Euclid can never meet on Earth, may meet somewhere in infinity. I have come to the conclusion that since I can't even understand that, I can't expect to understand about God. I acknowledge humbly that I have no faculty for settling such questions. I have a Euclidean earthly mind, and how could I solve problems that are not of this world? And I advise you never to think about it either, my dear Alyosha, especially about God, whether he exists or not. All such questions are utterly inappropriate for a mind created with an idea of only 3 dimensions." End quote. We tend not to think much about Euclidean notions of space today, since the ethical and theological implications that it once caused for European thought have evaporated. And this is mostly because our modernity is determined by our very ability to accept alternative notions of space. And if you have any doubt about that, just go to a science fiction movie, where you see all sorts of odd notions about space put up there on the screen for you. So keeping this point in mind allows us to understand a bit better how important Euclid once was to European culture, including especially its long-standing confrontation with the divine. In this context, Ivan Karamazov's fraternal advice makes two things clear. First, as I noted at the outset, we can understand the history of European thought as a series of successive spatial regimes, which boils down to essentially pre-Euclidean, Euclidean, and post-Euclidean. Second, Dostoevsky and company confronted a mathematical maw that was even more hostile to the divine than the previous one had been, since it undermined the very notion of rationality and creation. And in this context, we can see that from an intellectual historical perspective, something extraordinary happened. Euclidean geometry, which had so insistently ushered God to the cosmos's margin, had now become something quite different, and namely the last refuge of the Christian mind. And here we'll turn to one final image, which you've seen already. We can see our planetary home now with a new set of eyes, ones that allow us to recover something from a past that is now forgotten for reasons many and varied. And although we're quite comfortable with seeing the Earth in this way, that is, at a distance that we've never actually experienced, the conceptual unity that envelops this spatial whole, and that even makes it possible for us to understand it as our Earth, dates to the Spatial Reformation's initial claim to God's mantle. Thus, using the history of space as our primary reference point, we can see that although the little God still moves his mind to the heavens, he has, after centuries of dialogue with the divine, ceased his trembling. I thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Mike. What we'll do now is I'll have a short dialogue with Mike on the topics he has just presented. And then later we'll open the talks to you, okay? So this is the book. And I must say it's a solid piece of intellectual history, bringing us from Middle Ages and Renaissance to postmodernism even. And I think that his cultural links, Mike's cultural links to our heritage, our European Occidental heritage, are really something to ponder about. And I'd like to just add a few questions, perhaps, and comments. First of all, about your time framing. Even though you restrict yourself to the printed book of Euclid mostly, there were Euclid's commentators since antiquity. And we should include the Arabian world writers, Byzantium, of course, where Nicholas of Cusa went to get more manuscripts, and early European Middle Ages. So this, your time frame leaves us with the sensation that this spatial conditioning through Euclid started just at the Renaissance, but couldn't it be of a longer duration process?
Euclid never goes away, but since you mentioned the ancient commentaries, I went back and I looked at, all the way back to Proclus in the 4th century. They never get past book 6. They comment on often the first 3 books, and then sometimes the next 3, but they never get into spherical space. And this is particularly the case in the 12th and 13th century commentaries in Latin. They simply do not discuss anything beyond planar space. And that is why when you mentioned Cusa, why he is so important, because he goes to Byzantium, along with others, he's not alone, and they get original, all right, they get Greek language manuscripts.
Right.
And in the process of translating those manuscripts, they discover these other books. They always knew they were there, but the previous medieval versions sometimes didn't even include them. So one example, a classic, is the one done by Boethius, which disappeared. In the 6th century AD, there's a translation done by a Roman who gets executed by the barbarian emperor for plotting with the Byzantine king. He knows he's going to die, so Boethius, Anicius is actually his first name, Anicius Boethius, starts to try to translate every single classical text he can get his hands on, and one of them is Euclid, but he only gets to book 5. And so in the Latin realm, a lot of those later books simply disappeared because the text is gone.
Yeah, I agree with you, but also I assume that ancient Greeks from the time of Euclid got to the 13 books.
They certainly still read it, but even in Proclus, he's already stopped reading it.
Yeah, but the heliocentric system devised by Aristarchus of Samos in the 3rd century before Christ was followed by the spectacular measurement or calculation, better saying, of the terrestrial diameter by Eratosthenes. So these people were deeply embedded in Euclidean geometry. Didn't this figure like a mental representation of what would become later the terrestrial globe itself?
Yeah, but it takes 1,000 years. That's fundamentally the problem, is that what Eratosthenes did in measuring the globe, what Claudius Ptolemy did in creating his maps, those texts all disappear from the West almost entirely. There are mentions that these things had been done. Eratosthenes is around because of the doxographies. You know, and he's just a name. But the mental apparatus that was necessary to wrap the terrestrial realm in this kind of space and to divide it mathematically, as Ptolemy did, the texts are gone. And Ptolemy is the example, because he returns in the 15th century as well, as does Strabo, another one of the great geographers. So a lot of the mental apparatus that Eratosthenes clearly used, that Ptolemy clearly used, the texts are simply gone, and they stay in Byzantium where they're in Greek. And with the collapse of post-Roman civilization, it essentially becomes a Latin-only zone. So although there are people who can still read Greek, the texts are no longer translated. So any original copy, say, of Euclid's Elements, which is still around, since it's done on parchment, it has to be recopied. But if there's no one to copy it, then the parchment disappears. So over centuries, Euclid simply goes away. And that's why, as you mentioned, people have to go back to Byzantium to get him. They have to go back to Byzantium to get Claudius Ptolemy. They have to go back to get Strabo. All of these people are gone for nearly 1,000 years. And this is, as I mentioned in the book, why Europeans in the West forget how to make globes. There's no globe made in the West between the year 400 and the year 1400, period, as far as we know.
Well, Mike, I suspect that it didn't disappear at all. It persisted perhaps in small circles and so on. But that's another issue, but let's move on. Now, I know that there were astrolabes built in the Arabic world, which incorporated spherical trigonometry. There, as you mentioned, triangles, angles, sum is not 108 degrees. Do you think that this Arabian step, which the Europeans only achieved later in the 17th century, did this defy traditional plane geometry for at least Arabs?
I've discussed this with Middle Eastern scholars, and one of the things they suggest in trying to understand how Euclid affected the geography of Middle Eastern thought and also its astronomy is that the the Islamic conception of God is such a radical abstraction that they never perceived an inherent conflict between space and the belief in God, because they don't put him anywhere in the same way that you saw in these images where God had to have a place. So they're not driven, medieval thinkers are not driven to actually explain incompatibilities or even compatibilities with God, because God simply can't be anywhere. He's such a summary, philosophical summary figure that that kind of conflict that drives, what I argue, drives European thought from 1350 on never occurs to them. Yeah. That said, they're also Aristotelians, the purest of Aristotelians. And so the mathematics that you see in the astrolabe, I don't know how many of you know what an astrolabe is. It's a little disk that is in essence a compressed cosmos, and you use it to find your position with respect to the stars, which are in theory on a sphere up above. But the astrolabe is not a map. So that because the Middle Easterners in the 12th century are pure Aristotelians, it never occurs to them to make a globe. To the extent that we have any evidence of a globe being made by Islam, there is one globe that may have been made in Iran in the 13th century. It is shipped to China and then it disappears. So again, it's this Aristotelian backdrop that I mentioned. If you need a philosophical explanation for the cosmos, then Aristotle's sense of space will predominate over the Euclidean, and Euclidean becomes ancillary and for the purpose of measurement, and it is not coincidental that the astrolabe becomes a very important tool for measuring distances, because it never actually places in question the relationship of heaven and earth.
Yes. How do you see the importance of linear perspective as formulated by Brunelleschi around 1415, written down by Alberti, just about the same time, and practiced at first by Massacius in his Holy Trinity regarding spatial consciousness?
It is one of those things that raises philosophical issues for anyone in the Renaissance. The theory of linear perspective is based on the notion that the canvas, or whatever it is they're painting on, is essentially a window. And the window comes with 2 points. One is what's called I think it's the vision point, they call it? The vision point, and then the disappearing point.
We say also fugue point. We in Portuguese say fugue point.
Okay, so you have essentially 2 triangles, right? But what fascinates Renaissance artists, Albrecht Dürer is a particular example because I noticed he used his melancholia in the image. What fascinates the Renaissance artist is that this whole is entirely humanly constructed, so that human beings can paint on the window. You can have someone in the physical world looking through the window and seeing another world which is also human. And these 2 things are then combined with Euclid's elements. So it is no coincidence that all the people you mentioned, particularly Alberti, took lessons in geometry. Because they were thinking about angles in a uniform space. And if we go back to the medieval image, Jesus of Nazareth with the compass, even though the whole image is geometric, there is no perspective. Okay? Because it's depicting, it's a religiously symbolic depiction of humanity's relationship to the divine, which has no place in that kind of production of space.
I also find it striking that the early painters of this period achieved spherical perspective, like for example the Van Eyck portrait of the Arnolfini marriage.
With the globe in the background.
Yes. And that would lead perhaps to imagine something out of this world.
Globes keep appearing in, especially the paintings of the 16th and 17th centuries, because they're perceived as the highest intellectual achievement of European thought, is that we can take the whole earth and stick it on this sphere. This is what Donne was writing about, and produce knowledge. So wealthy people started to buy globes. Ambassadors would have globes. There are all sorts of, there's a famous painting from the same Dutch school of, I can't remember which set of ambassadors.
Oh yes, Holbein.
And they're standing there like this, you know, because it's like having a big horse. You know, you have your globe and you're displaying your knowledge. your status as a Renaissance person by having one of these globes in front of you. They were enormously expensive in that time. But one of the things I argue in the book is that to put a globe into a painting isn't simply to extol the virtue of the person you're painting, but it's to show the uniformity of this spatial knowledge, because you, as a person outside the painting, are looking inside to this world. The space is continuous across the frame, across the window pane, and inside that world, the same rules apply. So that's the Cusan problem, because what Nicholas Cusa says is, even though we're not everything, we are still these little gods, and we are creating our culture. And in creating our culture, he thinks we eventually bump into God. Others later say, no, actually what we're doing is that we're expelling God.
Yeah. And also Cusa is related to the infinity in mathematics. You know, one of his famous statements is that the circle, there's no center. The center is everywhere. So it's moving out.
Which he gets from 6th century writers,
Right.
who are trying to figure out what to do with Euclid, but can't figure it out. Because they can't relate Euclid to the divine.
Okay. Now, getting back to the spatial reformation, we have the problem of cartography, map making, because it was soon realized that every projection, like Mercator's projection and others, induced to errors. I mean, they are not exact, they can't be exact projections of a sphere onto a plane. Do you think this is also relevant?
Funny that you should mention that. I'm writing a book called The Cartographic Fool, which we just discussed earlier. And what I see in the 16th century is that the problem with cartography, for some people, not for everyone, but mostly for Catholics, is that in order to create that kind of map, in which you get the whole globe laid out flat, you have to contort the terrestrial sphere. So Mercator, what he did in his famous map is he turned the Earth into, in effect, a column, and then he sliced off the geography and he laid it flat. If you're a Catholic and you associate, as in Catholic devotional art did, Jesus of Nazareth with the sphere, the Erdapfel is what they say in German, with the little cross on top, it's called the Globus Cruciger. If you associate Jesus of Nazareth with the sphere, you inherently cannot accept a map that distorts the terrestrial surface. So there are all sorts of debates in the 16th century in Antwerp, which I happen to be studying at the moment, about what to do with this. What kind of map is most appropriate? And what happens is that the Catholics begin to emphasize hemispherical projections. So instead of giving you the whole Earth as a sheet, they give you two halves of the orange. And that then allows many of them, not all of them, but many of them, to see geography both as a way of learning about the Earth, but also as remembering Jesus of Nazareth's sacrifice. And you get a split. It actually gets down to a split in Bibles. I've just been studying this. If you look at the King James Version of the Bible, it has a map in it of the Holy Land, complete with geographic coordinates, laid flat. Whereas a Bible, the Biblia Regia, which is produced by the Spanish in Antwerp in 1572, I think it's finished, has the two hemispheres as its map.
Yeah.
So that you don't lose sight of what's really important.
Very interesting. I want to go back to Kepler's use of geometry. Because you showed us the Mysterium Cosmographicum, famous representation. But in the harmony of the world, the Harmonia Mundi, Kepler, I think, went beyond that, beyond his own past error of circular orbits. And he seemed to be worried about space quantization. Like, the orbits cannot be anywhere randomly. They must be in definite places. And I think this is the first step really towards quantization of space, something that is still bothering modern physicists and mathematicians. This is just a comment. I don't know if you want to add anything to it.
My sense in Kepler is that the shift from the Mysterium Cosmographicum to the Harmonia Mundi, because he couldn't get around the fact that his readings, or the readings that he inherited from Tycho Brahe, suggested that the Earth's orbits were not circular. You just can't get it. He couldn't justify it mathematically. So he had to let go of the mysticism, and that mystical aspect of understanding the distance of the planets through the Platonic spheres is actually not Euclidean, it's Platonic. He gets it from the Timaeus. Yes. And so he's actually not letting go of Euclid because the space remains the same. He's letting go of Platonic mysticism. So there is an underlying continuity, but the break is actually in philosophy. And he can do this because, of course, he's Christian. He's not, he can say, oh, well, God made it this way instead, which he actually said.
Yes. You also deal a lot in your book with the figure of Gauss. Mm-hmm. He was the prince of the mathematicians, and yes. But
his brain is still in Göttingen. Yeah. If you want to see his brain.
I actually saw one of his stone marks near Braunschweig, mm-hmm. Germany, where he tried to measure as much as possible to see if triangles in space, our space, really sum up their angles to 180 degrees. Mm-hmm. And that was a way of proving, although Gauss endowed in known Euclidean geometries as well, but I think he insisted on the fact that this world is Euclidean. Mm-hmm. Mental worlds could be something else.
Mm-hmm. I don't disagree, and this is why he sent his student. Yeah. Riemann was his student. He suggested the dissertation that blew up Euclid, but Gauss himself was a down-the-line Protestant. Although he was an advanced mathematician, he was a down-the-line Protestant. So the whole idea, even though he claimed he'd invented it all before his student, I don't think he actually went there out of religious reasons.
And one final comment. You want to say something? One final comment is about what is at the very end of your book. I'd like to see something more of it when you mention the fractured space of cubism. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, Picasso's The Mosaic d'Avignon is also frequently cited as his conversion to relativism and to non-Euclidean geometry. Do you agree with that?
I agree that the shift to cubism, it's not just him, of course, there are other artists, is basically the final end of Platonism. I'll put it to you that way. I don't necessarily think of it in terms of Euclid. I'll put it this way. There is a mathematician named Paul Tannery, 19th century France. He made it his life's goal to import modernist mathematics, which he had been reading about in Germany, into France. So he wrote in a series of mathematical journals what was going on in Göttingen. And he's trying to explain to everybody who has no idea what's going on what this means. That they've just destroyed Euclid, you realize what this, and he has to essentially inform the French mathematical community that a big thing has just happened and you need to get on board. So he writes in a series of essays that appear, I think, in a Belgian journal, that in this new geometric system, a Platonic form, whatever it may be, the pyramid or the dodecahedron or whatever, can move through space and change shape as it goes. And if you're a Platonist, it's over from that point on. The whole idea that eternal forms can suddenly shift and that we can understand these shifts changes how humanity relates to space. And that crack-up is then reflected in all of this reimagination of how to present art, how to think about perspective. I mean, there is no perspective in Picasso's work. That's the Renaissance perspective is blown up. The whole idea that there's any eternity that you can produce with a canvas is blown up, and it's rooted in this explosion of modernist mathematics, which after 1850 dominates, as I mentioned, with you have Dostoevsky writing about it. Yeah. Everyone in the late 19th century is being forced to confront with the fact that all of the verities have been blown up by the mathematicians. You can't read Euclid anymore, you can't read Plato, Aristotle's been dead for centuries, where do we go? And you get this explosion of people taking art in different ways. It's not just space. If you read if you look at the German expressionists, who are doing their work at much the same moment that Picasso is, they give up on shape entirely and go into color. Mm-hmm. Painting is about colors. It's not about space. So that's another book.
Okay, thank you. Now, if you have questions, you want to say something before?
I want to thank Michael and congratulate you for your brilliant speech. It was very provocative. Buy the book, please. So, I will. And I would like to propose some question. Since assuming that space can be a representation, can we talk about rhetoric of the space?
Rhetoric of space?
Rhetoric of the space.
I would begin with the logic, because particularly in the 17th century, people begin to appropriate Euclid for his logic entirely. That is, he becomes that. They almost forget about his space. And so the significance of his style of argumentation is that every step is clear. You begin with a certain supposition, you then ground that, you elaborate that supposition in steps, and then you reach a conclusion. And to the extent that there is a rhetoric, it's not the classic rhetoric, the idea of persuading, it's that there is a structure inside the human mind that Euclid has encapsulated perfectly for us and that we must bring to our children. So John Locke, for instance, writes a whole book on how to educate students properly without destroying their brains. Not a topic that's, it's a topic that's relevant, I would think. And he says you should read Euclid. Every child should read Euclid so that they learn how to structure their arguments and then enter into debate with the madmen, because those are the people he was really after. So it's not the Ciceronian idea of persuading the crowd and getting them to go to war. It's the idea that you can take serious subjects and reduce them to these little blocks and then present them as logical arguments.
Thank you very much, Michael. I thank Gildo, my fellow and friend from my department, for his comments. And now we have perhaps 10 minutes for questions from the audience.
Se vocês quiserem, pode fazer em português e a gente...
We can translate it.
Thank you. I'm a plastic artist, and your speech, thank you, Gildo, because you made me happy with your observations, because I would feeling some commentaries about the importance of the spatial reformation in art, in the world art, especially because you mentioned the book of Albert, who wrote the book Daptura, where he tries to explain how to interpret the 3D world into the words. That's very interesting. And this spatial reformation brought to world of art many others interesting points of view concerned about God, for example, concerned about the social meaning where people were living at that time, And that's very interesting because when you are bored, linear perspective, I was, oh God, somebody, perhaps you are bored this in his book. Concerning also your observation about Picasso and relativity, no? Yes, we think there is something alike, because when this movement was appearing, no, the context, the idea of relativity of Einstein was also in the media, no, in the thought of people. You know, the best artists along the history, human history, was also talking to the philosophers, now scientists, no? So they were also, at the time, great artists, of course, no? Following what was discussing in philosophy. So I think, yes, this is. But I would like to finish with a question. When you read the books of Ptolemy, no, a part of linear perspective, it's a comment, because one of the books was lost, so we have the information only about commentaries. But as artists, when you learn these comments, you realize that they knew the linear perspective, yes, because he was explaining exactly how we teach in schools. No, we explain exactly like Leon Battista Albert. You mentioned the glass, the window glass. Right. No, that's very interesting. I was teacher in Liceu de Artes e Ofícios, and you use the windows glass to teach to the students to draw using the lines, because it's easier to them to understand. No, that when you are trying to explain in words. So do you think they also knew linear perspective in the times of Ptolemy? Thank you very much.
I think there's evidence that they did, but the problem is that so much of their art is gone. And to the extent that we can ascribe a linear perspective to them of the sort that we use, which is in the plastic arts, and including certain aspects of the history of science, such as globes, you have to look to the archaeologists who keep discovering Roman living rooms. And in Roman living rooms, they almost always had these frescoes, and they very often included exactly these kinds of things, these natural environments with people, which required linear perspective, although we don't have the books in which they elaborated such a theory. But, and this is given my own personal interest, what often appears in these Roman living rooms are globes. So we know they had them. And we know that they used that mathematics and created the environment in which they lived according to this sort of stuff. What you mentioned about Ptolemy brings me back to the central point, which is that before really 1350, when the great reappropriation from Byzantium begins, is the almost total absence of the key texts. So Ptolemy's work of astronomy is known as the Almagest in English. It makes it into the Middle Ages. So there are 13th century manuscripts. But his geography disappears, and it stays in Byzantium until it's rediscovered in the course of the 14th century by I can't remember his name now, but an archivist working in Constantinople. And as the Turkish armies advance toward Constantinople, then a lot of these manuscripts are simply shipped up and sent westward to Florence, and this is why we have the geography back. But the geography doesn't come back until the early 15th century. So all of these intellectual apparati that were floating around in the world, you mentioned, they're gone. There's a bit of a debate about this, but near as I can tell, with respect to Ptolemy's geography, which includes this spherical mathematics that you could use on Earth, there is simply no medieval Latin version, period. We have never found anything. The first Latin versions are like 1410, something like that. So, which is evidence that he's gone, in effect. Although people knew the text existed, they didn't have access to it.
There's a question here.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your talking. My name is Taimara, and I'm trying to speak in English. If I couldn't, I will ask in Portuguese. I would like that you comment more about the transition between the notion of place, because place it was important to Aristotle, and the notion of space, because they are different. So when you resolve the Euclid's proposition, you can see that he says two triangles are equals, and you have two triangles, and we know that our space is homogeneous, isotropic, and blah blah blah, but this didn't is not present in elements. So we can recognize that the space are in that form, but Euclid doesn't talk in space, in homogeneous space. So when occurs these transitions between the notion of place and space? I don't know if you understand.
Yeah, no, when Aristotle is translated into Latin, place is locus. So he's interested in understanding what a given position's locus is, because he has to explain the functioning of the cosmos. And his central issue he isn't interested in where the cosmos comes from. That's Christian. He didn't know this, but that's a Christian interest. He's only interested in explaining motion. And to do that, he has to create this system of spheres in which you get perfect motion above, that through some gearage, which he never actually explains, is then brought down to the moon, and then inside the lunar sphere is chaos. It's just nothing but irregularity. So for him, locus begins with this hierarchical relationship in which you have motion beginning above, perfect, and then coming down to the center. And he then expands on this notion of locus because he has the theory of the four elements. So that there are these things called earth, air, fire, and water, and they simply move to the center of the cosmos. He doesn't explain how. We don't know why. He simply says this is where they gather. And so locus is for him ultimately the sign that everything moves to the center. But it is not a good center. I think you were applying good to that earlier. It is a bad place, right? It is a zone of change. So locus is actually the mud that Melanchthon mentions. Now, Euclid is not interested in any of that. He doesn't have to explain motion. He doesn't have to explain anything. He just has to create a system of idealized space. And inside of that, what the first words of his book are, a point is that which has no part. Punctum est quius non pas est. What the hell is that? Okay? It's nothing. And yet he builds an entire logical structure on nothing. And this never stops fascinating people. The artist in the back, Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks are full of explanations of Euclid. He says, yeah, a point is the thing that has nothing. Albrecht Dürer does the same thing. He writes it in his own books. A point is nothing. Now, how can we get from nothing to producing something? The very fact that human beings are doing this makes us different, makes us these little gods. And the conceptual problem becomes when the philosophical presuppositions that are in Aristotle have to somehow be fit into a Euclidean matrix. If this idealized space is applicable to the world, then all of the interests that Aristotle brought to his philosophy are no longer valid. And this is why the big winners in the Spatial Reformation are the mathematicians. We mentioned Kepler earlier, but Galileo, right? He creates an entire cosmos through his physics experiments because everything is in the same space and subject, therefore, to the same rules.
Okay.
One last question, perhaps? No? Okay. All right. So, we can... podemos agradecer a todos por virem aqui. Agradecemos... We thank Mike and Ana Paula for having let us do this opportunity. And the debates always go on. Obrigado.
Obrigada a todos.